Wednesday evening, July 25th, 1956. Captain Piero Calamai is standing on the bridge of the Andrea Doria, one of the finest luxury liners in the world. His second officer has alerted him to the presence of another ship in the area, and while others keep track of the radar, following the movement of the other vessel, Calamai stares out in the darkness at the thick fog that has enveloped his ship. It is just before 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Calamai is concerned, but not especially worried. He has made this journey many times under all kinds of circumstances. He has sailed through foggy conditions too many times to remember, and he has encountered his fair share of ocean-going vessels in busy shipping lanes. Still, he has every reason to be alert and concerned. 1,706 souls on board are depending on his expertise in getting them swiftly and safely to their destination, New York City. The journey, which had begun in Genoa, Italy on July 17th, is nearly over. If all went well and according to schedule, the Andrea Doria would be docking in New York the next morning. The other ship has turned out to be a bothersome presence, and to make matters worse, it is moving toward the Andrea Doria at a pretty good speed. Still, there is no reason to suspect that the two vessels won't be able to maneuver safely past each other. Over the next 20 minutes, Calamai confers with his officers on the Andrea Doria, and as a precautionary maneuver, he orders the helmsman to steer the ship 4 degrees to port. This adjustment, Calamai figures, will allow a safe starboard-to-starboard passage. Unfortunately for Calamai, the other ship has noted the Andrea Doria's presence and has made some course adjustments of its own. To Calamai's everlasting horror, the other ship, whose lights he can now make out about a mile in the distance, has made a turn that now has it bearing down directly on the Andrea Doria. Given the two ships' capabilities, along with the basic laws of physics, a collision is now inevitable. In desperation, Calamai orders his helmsman to turn the ship hard to the left, but the maneuver only makes the Andrea Doria a greater target for the other ship. In a moment he would never forget, Calamai watched as the other ship, a Swedish-American liner named the Stockholm, tore into the side of his ship with the force of hell unleashed.
The swimming pool started to spill at that angle, and all the decks on ships are very highly polished, and with this water running over them made the decks almost impassable.
The Andrea Doria, once the pride of Italian luxury liners, rests on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean in 255 feet of water off Nantucket Island. Time is never kind to shipwrecks, and it has done its work on the Doria. The ship came to rest on its right side, but its profile today is all but unrecognizable. Rust and corrosion, along with the toll taken by millions of sea organisms, have left the Andrea Doria a hulking mass of twisted, ruined steel. Over the course of this program, we will take a closer look at the final fateful voyage of the Andrea Doria. We will examine how a series of events led to what might seem like the impossible, the collision of two ships in the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean. We will also hear about one of the most dramatic sea rescues in maritime history, a heroic effort that saved over 1,600 people, even as the stricken Andrea Doria was in the process of sliding under the waves to her watery grave. After we have heard the account of the Doria's final voyage, we will visit her where she is today, on the floor of the ocean. We will see her from bow to stern in a close-up view rarely seen by the public. Finally, we will look at the controversy and air of mystery that immediately followed the demise of the Andrea Doria. Controversy and mystery that linger to this day. Predictably, no one wanted to assume responsibility for this, one of the greatest peacetime disasters in maritime history. A subsequent court hearing brought less than satisfactory conclusions. Now, through the testimony of experts on this shipwreck, we will try to answer some of the most compelling questions surrounding the events that took place on that fateful night. But first, let's go back to better times when the Andrea Doria was built and began her long string of successful transoceanic runs. The Andrea Doria was launched near Genoa on June 16, 1951, at a time that was crucial to the Italian passenger and shipping industries. World War II had decimated the country's merchant marine, and Italy was eager to get back in the running. The Andrea Doria was the first transatlantic vessel to be built in the country after the war. The majestic 697-foot vessel was everything one could have dreamed of. Its exquisite accommodations boasted of some of the finest craftsmanship imaginable. Paintings, statues, murals, tapestries, and other works of art, created by some of Italy's most accomplished artists and tastefully displayed throughout the ship, gave the Andrea Doria unparalleled elegance. Lounges, swimming pools, and ballrooms promised every passenger from first class to tourist class a comfortable and memorable journey. However, for all its comfort and good looks, the Andrea Doria was also designed for maximum efficiency and safety. Powered by steam turbines, the ship could reach a maximum speed of just over 25 knots, with a cruising speed of 22 knots. Its hull was divided into 11 watertight compartments designed to keep the ship buoyant even if two adjacent compartments were flooded, making the Andrea Doria virtually unsinkable, or so it seemed. The Andrea Doria quickly established its reputation as one of the best in the business, and people lined up for the chance to take the journey across the Atlantic between Genoa and New York City. The ship had made exactly 100 trips prior to its final journey. Captain Piero Calamai had been with the Andrea Doria from the very beginning. He had been the only commander the ship had ever known. A graduate of the Nautical Institute in Genoa, Calamai had served his country in both world wars, receiving decorations after each of the global conflicts. With extensive experience in the merchant marine, he was an ideal candidate to command the flagship of the Italian line. And in his 3 years' service on the Andrea Doria, he had distinguished himself as a fair and able officer. The Andrea Doria's last run began uneventfully. The ship pulled out of Genoa's harbor on Tuesday, July 17, 1956. Stopping off in Naples, Cannes, and Gibraltar before heading out to the open sea. She was scheduled to arrive in New York on July 26th. On board were 1,134 passengers and a crew of 572. It was smooth sailing until late in the afternoon on Wednesday, July 25th, when Captain Calamai noted foggy conditions on the western horizon. Fog was hardly a stranger to the area, especially at this time of year, when the warm Gulf Stream waters met the much cooler waters in the north. With its state-of-the-art navigational equipment, including 2 radar scopes, the Andrea Doria was more than capable of taking on the fog. Captain Calamai took all the preliminary precautions. He ordered the ship's engineers to reduce speed, and he had both radar scopes turned on. The ship's watertight doors were closed, sealing off the compartments that would keep the Andrea Doria afloat, even in the event of a collision. The ship's whistle began to blast every 100 seconds. In the hours to come, the Andrea Doria would sail through variable fog conditions ranging from patchy to very thick fog. Conditions grew worse after sunset, but were still not bad enough to cause Captain Calamai and his crew any major concern. By Calamai's calculations, the Andrea Doria, traveling at a reduced speed, would be arriving in New York behind schedule, but only by about an hour. The Andrea Doria passed several slower-moving ships, all moving westward over the next few hours. Such maneuvers were completely normal and happened uneventfully, even in the fog. Shortly before 10:30, the Doria passed the Nantucket Lightship, which was stationed about 200 miles east of New York City. Captain Calamai had to feel confident. He was almost at his westbound destination. The Swedish-American liner, the Stockholm, had left New York at 11:30 that morning, bound for Gothenburg. It carried 534 passengers. The Stockholm, like the Andrea Doria, was the pride of its country's passenger vessels. At 524 feet and 12,644 tons, the Stockholm was considerably smaller than the Doria. But nevertheless, at the time of its launching in 1948, it was the largest passenger liner ever to come out of Sweden. The Stockholm's bulkheads had been reinforced with steel plating to allow the ship safe passage through the icy waters around its homeland. And like other modern liners, it boasted of an enviable combination of the finest comfort and safety features. Commanding the Stockholm was Captain Harry Gunnar Nordenson, who at 63 had a lifetime of experiences at sea. Captain Nordenson had been in command of the Stockholm since 1955, and during his tenure, he had guided the vessel across the Atlantic 423 times. Captain Nordenson was below deck working on paperwork in his cabin when a blip appeared on the Stockholm's radar shortly before 11 o'clock in the evening on July 25th. At that time, the ship's third officer, Johan Ernst Karstens Johansson, known to his mates as Karstens, was on watch. Karstens, who had spent 9 of his 26 years at sea, noted the presence of the other ship and set out to plot its exact location and course. As we will see, the decisions made aboard both the Stockholm and the Andrea Doria, combined with some very bad luck and timing, led directly to a collision that could easily have been avoided. However, for the time being, let's advance our story to the moment of impact, to a moment when fate changed the lives of 2,240 people who were literally thrown together in the highest of dramas. The ice-reinforced bow of the Stockholm ripped into the side of the Andrea Doria with tremendous force, crushing everything in its path and burying itself 30 feet into the side of the stricken ship. The Stockholm's ice-reinforced bow had a devastating effect and was met with almost no resistance. Shortly before impact, when he had realized that a collision was unavoidable, Karstens had ordered the Stockholm's engines to be reversed to full speed astern. The last-minute directive had no effect on prohibiting the collision itself. Such measures took time that the Stockholm didn't have. But when the ship finally twisted away from the Andrea Doria, the collision's damage was immediately noticeable. The Doria, of course, had suffered the worst from the collision. A gaping V-shaped hole, shaped exactly like the bow of the Stockholm, had left the Andrea Doria fatally wounded. Water flooded into the nearly empty starboard fuel tanks and into the damaged airtight compartments, compromising the Doria's carefully designed safety features, and the ship immediately began to list. People were running and screaming everywhere, trying to locate loved ones and scrambling for their lives.
Because as an officer in charge of the vessel, I had all the passport key. On the bridge, everybody was arriving there. The captain gave order to lower the port side boat. That was I was in charge of that. But it was impossible because of the list. The boats were supposed to be lowered with maximum 15 degrees of list. We had 19, so that was not possible. So I came back on the bridge and the captain gave different orders. I asked the captain if I had to give the abandon ship signal. He told me no, because we have enough boats.
ran through the hallway. What I can remember seeing the hallway already on its side, because it was like hanging one side and holding on to a rail until the other side because the ship was already lost its balance.
What I do, I got a duty, to help all the passengers to get out of the ship. When the captain say you got to empty in the ship, whatever. We got so many lifeboats we can save, another 500 people more what we did. And all the crew, we help all the people, get off the ship.
Plus the fact that we were coming into New York, or scheduled to come into New York the next morning. So a good deal of the luggage was already on deck, which was just so burdensome and in the way that it was absolutely ridiculous to have to fight these pieces of baggage.
We put my daughter on a rope after, so different ordeal, little things happen. We put her on a rope to lower her down to maybe some lifeboat coming in from Ile de France and Cape. They see her and pick her up. But the rope we put her, we don't tie them good. And as we let her down, people let her down, she's getting loose and she's screaming for me. And I, jump off about 42 foot in the water to get my daughter.
The Stockholm was also badly damaged, although to nowhere near the extent of the Andrea Doria. The bow of the Stockholm had been thoroughly crushed and pushed back more than 30 feet. Its forward bulkhead had been badly damaged and was letting in some water, but it continued to hold its own. The crew in quarters at the bow of the ship had been killed or badly wounded by the collision, but the casualties were much lighter than on the Doria, where the crash had exacted a deadly toll. Meanwhile, on board the Andrea Doria, Captain Calamai had numerous decisions to make. Fortunately, the ship's modern fireproofing had kept the Andrea Doria from danger when showers of sparks had flown during the collision. However, the threat of fire was only a small part of Captain Calamai's concerns. The Andrea Doria was now leaning heavily on its right side, and with the ship's pumps unable to control the rush of seawater pouring in from the hole in the Doria's hull, Captain Calamai feared the worst. The Andrea Doria, designed to be unsinkable, was in grave danger of going down. The big question was, when? Calamai ordered his radio operator to send an SOS signal to any ship in the area, and he ordered his crew to prepare to abandon ship. For a short time, he entertained the hope that he might be able to maneuver the crippled vessel to shallow waters, where he could save the ship by grounding it. But he quickly gave up on the notion. His main responsibility was to save the lives of his passengers and crew. In a sense, it was fortunate that the collision had taken place where it did. The shipping lanes around Nantucket Island were always busy, and a number of ships received the Andrea Doria's SOS. Some, like the Cape Ann, a United Fruit Company freighter, and the William H. Thomas, a Navy transport, although rather small and holding only a few lifeboats, rushed to the scene. Others made their way as quickly as possible. The largest ship in the area, a French luxury liner called the Ile de France, was nearly 2 hours away. Upon hearing the Andrea Doria's call for help, it immediately left for the site of the wreck. Back on the Andrea Doria, every effort was being made to remove passengers from the ship in a safe and orderly fashion. The ship's heavy list had rendered half of its lifeboats useless, and there was some confusion as the best way to launch the ones that were usable. When the Stockholm realized that it was not going to sink, it radioed the Andrea Doria and told Captain Calamai that it would take on as many passengers as conceivably possible.
We worked our way around the back of the ship and then down another deck, and then they had ropes. And when my sister looked over the side of the ship down to the boats below and the rope, she wasn't going to go. So the people in line started yelling, "Throw her overboard, throw her over." I said, gee, this is a terrible way for people to act. I'm going to throw this kid over. So my mother said, I'll go down first, then your sister will go. If I go, she'll follow. So my mother took this thick hemp rope, grabbed it and slid probably 50 feet and just burned her arms or legs, and then my sister went. Now, being a young boy, I was going to show off and swirl down the rope, you know, twist. And I did a half a twist, and my life jacket got snagged on the side of the ship where someone had welded a piece of iron to paint the side of the ship with, and I let go of the rope. Now I'm hanging there. The rope is gone, and I'm hanging off the side of the ship by the back of my life jacket. And so this elderly man had seen this. He climbed down to the deck below and unhooked me. In the meantime, the people in the lifeboats had gotten the rope back to me, and I made it back down to the lifeboat. And right before I went onto the rope, I looked through that little glass window. I looked at my bike. It was in 3 pieces, wrapped up in brown paper, and then over the side I went. And that was the last I saw of the bike.
The Ile de France arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning, making its way through the fog and positioning itself on the Andrea Doria's starboard side. Over the next few hours, it took on 753 survivors from the Doria. The Stockholm gathered 545 survivors, while other ships in the area accounted for 364. All told, an amazing 1,662 passengers and crew members moved from the Andrea Doria to the safety of other vessels. A truly amazing feat.
My wife was a very extravagant woman. She bought the most expensive ticket for the boat, and I resented it because I said, we can go back. I was the saving person who liked to save money. So we fought about 2-3 days, and she finally gave in. Usually I lost when it came to money, but that time I won out, and she changed the ticket right when we were on a boat. So our cabin number was 56, which the side the crash happened, and we were on the other side because of my cheapness.
A young man took his very young daughter, thinking that everyone on board, left on board at that moment, would go down with the ship. He dropped his daughter overboard, aiming her into a lifeboat, and unfortunately he missed the target, and his daughter died the next day. He hit the gunnel of the, she hit the gunnel after dropping about 25 or 30 feet. That was the horror story, one of the horror stories. There were many other horror stories, but that was one that took place at that moment.
By first light of dawn, only Captain Calamai and a handful of crew members remained on board the Andrea Doria. Calamai had radioed for tugboats with the faint hope that the ship could still be towed to shallow water, where it could be beached. But by 5 o'clock in the morning, it was obvious that this was not going to happen. As it was almost miraculous that the Andrea Doria was still afloat. Her list was now nearly 40 degrees, and it was only a matter of time before she rolled onto her side and sank. Nevertheless, Captain Calamai had no intention of leaving his ship. At one point, he turned to an officer standing next to him and made his intentions clear. "If you go back to Genoa and see my family," he said, "you will be my witness. You can say that I am at peace with myself. I did what I had to do." The remaining crewmen and officers were not about to leave Calamai on board the ship alone. If he refused to abandon the ship, they told the captain that they would stay as well. Calamai had no choice but to climb aboard a lifeboat. It was just after 5:30. The Andrea Doria remained stubborn to the bitter end. To the amazement of those watching from the safety of rescue ships, the Doria stayed afloat for more than 4 more hours. Finally, at 9:45 in the morning, she rolled over onto her right side, and after foundering in the surface for 15 minutes, slipped beneath the waves. The proud luxury liner was now part of maritime history. Word of the Andrea Doria's sinking spread quickly. It seemed inconceivable that such a modern vessel could suffer such a fate. In their accounts of the disaster, some reporters compared the Andrea Doria's demise with the sinking of another fabled luxury liner, the Titanic. Fortunately, the rescue operations had given the Andrea Doria story a much happier ending. The Andrea Doria came to its final resting place in 255 feet of water. She lies on her right side, a massive shell of the great ship that she once was. A visit to her gravesite is sobering, yet at the same time it is thrilling. Even as we look upon the remains of the ship, we are reminded of how temporary all things are in life, how even the great give way to the demands of time. The ship is layered with fishing nets that make for a complex and dangerous extended deep water dive at a depth of 255 feet. Once a floating palace, the pride of Italy housing beautiful artwork, now an underwater wreck housing marine life. Now at the rear section, or stern of the ship, we look at the left or port wing bridge. A porthole still intact. Some teak decking still in remarkably good condition. Rich in marine growth, sea anemones cling to the railings. Now at the aft steering station, the helm stand. We now see a shot of the wheel before it was removed from the stand. This was used to operate the rear rudder during docking procedures. Entering the tourist class dining room, notice the tables still mounted to the floor. Due to the right angle and extreme depth of 200 plus feet, it is very easy for one to get disoriented. diver locates one of the ship's many coffee cups. Over a debris field, one of the ship's coffee cups. The diver now checks his gauges. It's easy to stir up silt, which lowers the visibility. And a spoon. Still more tables mounted to the floor. More debris lays scattered about. A revolving porthole still intact. One of the vessel's mammoth propellers. Coming up the fantail at the back of the ship. Another nice shot of the port stern wing bridge. Traveling down her port deck passageway. Another shot of her wood planking. You can see one of the nets draped over the vessel. It's now time for a long decompression before the divers can safely return to the surface. The demise of the Andrea Doria proved to be quite controversial. Predictably, a large number of wrongful death and personal injury suits were filed. And just as predictably, neither the Italian line or the Swedish-American line was willing to accept responsibility for the disaster. Attorneys representing the Italian line contended that the Stockholm's actions led to the collision. The Stockholm, they claimed, had been traveling outside the recommended shipping lane, and while that in itself was not illegal, it had made the meeting of the two ships possible. The Andrea Doria, they said, had been attempting a starboard-to-starboard passing, and the maneuver would have worked without a hitch if the Stockholm hadn't altered its own course and turned into the Andrea Doria. Lawyers for the Swedish-American line, of course, saw it much differently. The Andrea Doria, they said, had been traveling far too fast for the foggy conditions. There was no evidence to show that the officers on board the Doria had bothered to plot the Stockholm's course, even when they knew of the other ship's presence in the area. The logbook, it turned out, had gone down with the ship, despite Calamai's efforts to save it. Finally, when it was apparent that a collision was unavoidable, Captain Calamai had ordered the Andrea Doria to turn away from the Stockholm, which only made it a greater target for the other ship. Both arguments had plenty of merit. There is no question, for instance, that the Andrea Doria was traveling too fast for conditions. As soon as the ship encountered the fog, Captain Calamai had ordered a reduction of speed. But the reduction from 22 knots to 21 knots was little more than a token concession to the conditions. In Calamai's defense, the Andrea Doria had been equipped with the finest radar technology available, and he had every reason to feel confident that he could safely alter his course to accommodate other ships in the area. As a veteran commander of passenger liner, Captain Calamai knew the importance of arriving at port on schedule. Delays could be costly, and they could infuriate passengers. Too many late arrivals could cost a captain his position. The Stockholm, on the other hand, should not have veered off of its own planned course at the time of the collision. Captain Nordenson's argument was convincing. By taking that particular course, which he had been taking without a problem for 36 years, he was avoiding a maneuver that would have placed him in heavier cross traffic. His course was safer, quicker, and he pointed out, perfectly legal. Both sides had drastically different accounts of how their ships were moving just before the collision. In retrospect, it would appear that the Andrea Doria's account was the most accurate.
Well, in this particular case, the Stockholm hit the Doria and is probably its most vulnerable point. Because it had a reinforced bow that was used in some of the more severe winter-like conditions, that particular ship's bow was the strongest of any particular liner that was on that particular route. It actually breached the Doria at such an angle and pivoted to actually end up as a can opener. And this particular can opener sliced through what I believe is a big 40-foot gash. It was going at about 18 knots, so it probably went in and breached the keel, snapped around and blew through 3 watertight doors. Also, they had these different tube tanks that were used to get access to some of the deep compartment tanks. It breached those as well. A lot of those particular rows were not designed to take that type of hit, and it just opened the ship up all to the water.
Well, basically that night there was a collision that resulted in the incorrect assumption of radar range by Carson Johansson aboard the Stockholm. Carson Johansson was the third officer on watch at the time. He thought the radar was on the 15-mile scale. In actuality, it was on the 5-mile scale. He watched the Andrea Doria close from 12 to 6 miles. In reality, it closed from 4 to 2 miles. And he executed a turn to the right that ended in the collision. This chart shows how the two ships arrived at the collision point. It is a present-day chart that now shows separation zone in purple, an inbound lane and an outbound lane. In 1956, there was no separation zone. There were no traffic lanes. So the Stockholm was outbound on an easterly heading. The Andrea Doria was inbound on a westerly heading. It was a head-on-head situation, and the collision occurred at 23:11 at night on the 25th of July, 1956, in the middle of the separation zone as it now exists. The error in the use of the radar by the Carson Johansson, the Stockholm's third mate, was that he thought he was on the 15-mile scale and picked up the pip of the Andrea Doria that closed from 12 to 6 miles when he executed his turn to the right. In reality, he was on the 5-mile scale, and the Andrea Doria closed from 4 to 2 miles when he executed his turn to starboard, and that caused the collision. Believing that he was 6 miles away, in reality he was 2 miles away, and in addition the ship was yawing in a seaway left and right, so the pip of the Andrea Doria was to the left of his heading flasher, and he thought it was safe to come to starboard. The Stockholm's third officer, from his radar, had assumed that the Andrea Doria was closing from 12 to 6 miles away. He executed his turn to the right or to starboard, and as a result, the collision occurred at 23:11. The Andrea Doria was really in this position and had the Stockholm on radar, and when the Stockholm executed the turn to starboard, it was too late, and the collision resulted because of the turn to starboard. This illustration shows the imprint of the Stockholm's ice-reinforced bow that penetrated under the starboard bridge wing of the Andrea Doria. In the penetration, she twisted out, and as a result of twisting out, 3 compartments became flooded. These fuel tanks were near empty, adding that much dead weight on the right side or the starboard side of the ship. The ship immediately listed to the right or to starboard, 18 degrees, and by 10 hours later, she had rolled over and sunk. This is a version that's created by the Stockholm and Swedish American Lines of where the Andrea Doria was 1 minute before the collision, as sworn to by the lookout on the Stockholm. If the Andrea Doria was in this position 1 minute before the collision, the only way the Andrea Doria could have gotten to the collision was to execute an S-turn and increase her speed to 2,500 miles an hour, which of course is ridiculous. This is the court testimony from the Swedish American Lines that the Andrea Doria was in fact north, and that she executed this turn to her left and terminated in a collision. This, of course, is incorrect testimony. It would have required the Andrea Doria to double her speed to 44 knots, and of course the angle of impact is incorrect, as we have seen visually. Carson Johansson, during his watch, had taken 3 radio direction finder fixes. Radio direction finder fixes consist of tuning in radio frequencies to obtain their bearing and then plot on the chart. Where they cross is an RDF, or radio direction finder fix. The 3 fixes that he took, he indicated during the inquiry, was from 10 o'clock in the evening to 10:06. He did not change course. He took his second fix from 10:30 in the evening to 10:37. He changed course to 089. His third RDF fix he said he took at 10:48, took 3 minutes, and then he saw the pip of the Andrea Doria, or the radar contact of the Andrea Doria, 12 miles away. According to the course recorder graph, Carson Johansson did take 3 RDF fixes, but we believe he took his third RDF fix at 11:06, and that was the first time he picked up the radar contact of the inbound Andrea Doria. He thought it was 12 miles away. In reality, it was 4 miles away. And the change of course indicated here, the 094 is confirmed by the course recordograph. So the first time he picked up a radar contact, the Andrea Doria, was at this time and not at 10:51 as he claimed in the inquiry. It was very thick fog in the area. Since I was in the area, I can testify to the thickness of the fog. There was a wind from the southwest at the time. Where the collision occurred is where the Gulf Stream mixes with the Labrador Current coming down from the north, always produces fog.
Before the time, the collision, but 10 o'clock, for something happened, I was on the top, I saw there was fog. Thick, there was thick fog.
It was a little, the fog over there.
Yes, a lot of fog. Matter of fact, even when I got on the lifeboat, it was still foggy. I couldn't see too far. I couldn't even see any of the surroundings liner, which came up, to rescue us.
Oh, it was totally fogged. After dinner that evening, I went out on the deck and I put my hand in front of my face and you couldn't see your hand.
I think that's all part of the testimony in an effort to limit their liability. For one vessel to say it's clear, the other vessel to say it's foggy, for one vessel to say it's a right to right, for the other vessel to say it's a left to left.
A story of the Andrea Doria isn't one so much of tragedy, unlike the Titanic or the Lusitania. I think for the most part it was a story of survival, a story of rescue. And to be able in open water to essentially save over 1,800 people in a very, very difficult situation is more miraculous than anything else. I think we should look upon it in those lines. Those that were killed in the Doria, almost all of them were killed at the impact point. There were 6 on the Stockholm in the bow, the rest were on the Doria.
I think the rescue efforts were extraordinary. There was thick fog in the area, and for ships like the Ile-de-France to come back to the scene at a high rate of speed to save all the personnel, it was an amazing recovery. Marine officers, when they take their license exam or renew their license, must also take a radar test to ensure that they have proficiency in the use of their radar. So they would not misinterpret their radar the way Carsten Johansson, third mate on the Stockholm, misinterpreted his radar. In addition, there are traffic lanes in and out of the major ports in the world. These traffic lanes are separated by what is called a separation zone to ensure there's a good distance for safe left-to-left meeting situations or port-to-port meeting situations, ships inbound and outbound. In addition to that, VHF communications has been instituted as a requirement on Channel 13 so that ships can talk to one another by radio and arrange for a passing agreement. The only vessel sounding their fog whistle was the Andrea Doria. She was sounding it automatically every 2 minutes in accordance with the rules of the road. The Stockholm had indicated that it was all clear. She was not sounding her fog whistle, nor was she on standby engines. Her engines weren't ready for immediate maneuvering. Captain Calamai died in 1972. We feel that he became the scapegoat as a result of this accident and that no efforts were being made to clear his name. And my purpose in explaining the collisions is also an attempt to clear Captain Calamai's name and also to understand the pressure that he was under at the time.
These and other arguments were presented in an extended series of preliminary hearings designed to present evidence prior to a formal trial. The hearings, which went on for more than 3 months, ending when the two sides settled out of court, came to no clear-cut conclusion, other than the notion that both ships had to bear some of the burden for the collision. If anything, the passengers killed or injured in the collision came out of the hearings the worse off. The settlements, certainly by today's standards, were paltry. The controversy, however, was far from over. Over the ensuing decades, maritime experts have argued repeatedly about the events of July 25th, 1956. One of the more compelling discussions focuses on the actions of Johan Ernst Carstens Johansson, the Stockholm's third officer. According to some experts, Carstens may have misjudged the Andrea Doria's proximity. His miscalculation, the result of the way he read the Stockholm's radar.
Well, there's no doubt to me, after taking a look at the most recent evidence that has come out, that for the most part, the Swedish-American liner was looking at the wrong coordinates on the radar. There's different rings that you can hone in on the radar, given a certain spectrum of how far or how close they were. And I thoroughly believe, after looking at that and seeing the decisions that were made on the bridge of the Stockholm at the time, was that they were indeed reading the wrong radar readings. They were on a different rings. So rather than being farther out that they had anticipated, they were actually much closer.
I believe the cause of the accident was the Stockholm's third officer on watch at the time, Carstens Johansson, who misinterpreted his radar range.
These observations are important because in the aftermath of the Andrea Doria's sinking and the subsequent preliminary hearings, Captain Kalama'i took a great deal of blame for the disaster, and he would go to his grave a broken man, defeated by the sinking of his beloved ship. Kalama'i never sailed again after the Andrea Doria disaster, and he would always hear the accusations and second-guessing connected with his final voyage as a ship commander. If, as these maritime historians claim, the collision could be largely attributed to miscalculations on the part of the Stockholm, it is time that Captain Kalama'i's name be cleared once and for all. Obviously, none of this will bring back the Andrea Doria or those who perished in the wreck.
Well, right now the ship is deteriorating very much. Since the late 60s, the top 3 decks of the superstructure, which were made out of aluminum, have slid off into the sand, and there's nothing but a big junk pile. The rest of the hull itself is fairly intact, but all of the inside compartments are pretty much deteriorated to one sense or another. To one point they may be totally disintegrated, and others there might be just the frames, and others you could probably put your finger or your arm through it. It makes for very dangerous conditions. A lot of the wires have fallen down, air conditioning conduits have fallen down. It's easy to snare and trap somebody inside. The bathroom fixtures have all started to fall down and settle. It really makes for a very dangerous condition on the inside. So right now I think it's pretty much of a big treasure trap.
The Andrea Doria is now silent, but not forgotten. Its story, one of the most exciting and intriguing in modern maritime history.